Good afternoon. Thank you, Betsy.
No problem.
My name is Dama Absher, and I am with Florida's PBIS project. And I've got with me today Brooke Curtis,
Hi,
who,
everybody.
and we're just going to kind of tag team. I'll start us off with some of our initial information and turn it over to Brooke. And we're going to ask that you feel free to use the chat box at any time. If you have questions, we'll keep an eye on that and help monitor that if you have questions or comments throughout. And hopefully you can see my screen okay. So we're going to walk you through supporting Tier 3 with Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, and share some resources with you that we think you might find to be very valuable and useful in your school and district. And these are just some different ways you can connect with us and follow along with us. Florida's Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports Project is one of the 4 hubs as part of the National Center on PBIS. And you can find lots of resources at both of our websites. And then, of course, follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. And today I'm going to go through some of our objectives. We're going to really focus on discussing effective functional behavioral assessments and positive behavior intervention plans or behavior intervention plans. Brooke and I both and Betsy have been in districts and have heard folks refer to them as PBIPs, BIPs, BIPs. So when we talk about BIPs or behavioral intervention plans, that's what we're referring to. And we're going to talk about these things as part of your comprehensive Tier 3 practices. We will highlight some common barriers related to both the effectiveness of your district or school's Tier 3 practices, as well as the comprehensiveness of those Tier 3 practices. Then we'll set the stage as to why you might want to consider utilizing Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, or PTR is what we'll refer to it as well as a brief overview of what PTR is. You'll see how PTR is aligned with comprehensive FBA BIP practices and get a peek at some of those resources. If after this TA chat, you're interested in learning more about how your district or your school can access deeper professional development and or technical assistance related to PTR, we'll share more as we get to the end of the presentation, but just be sure if you're the district coordinator, then reach out to your technical assistance specialist from our project who's assigned to support your district. If you're not the district coordinator or you're not our direct line of communication, then know that you've got a local district coordinator you can reach out to, and that person serves as the liaison between your district and our project. And of course, like I mentioned, if you have any questions or comments during the chat, feel free to use the chat box at any time. So this looks familiar to all of us, I'm sure, but I want to just orient you to really what we're talking about today, where we are within the multi-tiered system of support. And within a multi-tiered system of support, the number of students who need a comprehensive FBA or BIP should be small. So remember, in theory, only about 1 to 5% of students need intensive individualized Tier 3 support, like at the tip of the triangle there. If you find that a large percentage of students seem to require that level of support, then other systemic factors probably need to be considered or reviewed. So if you are joining us today and you're in a role such as like a behavior specialist or analyst or school psychologist, and you find that your services at Tier 3 are requested more than seems appropriate, we encourage you to guide the school team back to looking at the effectiveness of Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports. And we say that because too many students who appear to need Tier 3 support will result in your school having insufficient resources to meet the needs of all of your students. So it's important when you think about matching student need to the level of support provided and appropriate resource allocation. A couple of things to keep in mind as we move forward. Tiers are not places, they're levels of support that are available for all students. One student could potentially need that level of support across all 3 tiers simultaneously. And it's also a good reminder that support provided must be aligned across all three tiers. So within each tier, you'll see there the problem solving steps or problem solving cycle or process in the middle. And we also want to remind you that across and within each tier, the same problem solving steps are used to develop and evaluate solutions. So during today's TA chat, we're going to focus on this top red part of the triangle and the way tier three supports are provided within a multi-tiered system of support. So this individualized support is a hallmark feature of tier three. However, what we want you to focus on is the way in which these individualized or intensive supports are developed and provided is systematically the same. So it's important to use an FBA BIP process for students who are exhibiting serious behaviors or addressing behaviors that are highly disruptive to the learning process and or may be dangerous to the student or others and or happens with high frequency. This process requires resources such as time to gather FBA data, develop a hypothesis, build that BIP, ensure that it's linked to the function of behavior based on the data that you gather, coach and train the teacher and any other support persons, paraprofessionals that play an important role in implementation of the BIP, and really to work through making decisions related to students' response to the intervention plan that's put together. The process is typically facilitated by individuals who have technical applied behavior analysis skills necessary to guide the team through that process. And so we feel like what we're going to share with you today is going to be beneficial at every level. If you're a support person, if you're a teacher, if you're that kind of person that has a lot of that content knowledge around applied behavior analysis principles. So let's dig a little deeper into what we're talking about when we think about a comprehensive FBA BIP process and how we're going to introduce the PTR model into that. So let's unpack this a little bit. During the FBA, we gather multiple sources of data, and it's centered around that agreed upon target problem behavior. We use indirect and direct methods to gather those pieces of data. And as you may recall, when you're doing this, you're reviewing events that happen in the environment right before the behavior of concern. So we often refer to those as the antecedents or those setting events, and reviewing the responses within the environment right after the behavior occurs. And we often refer to those as the consequences. And then the result of that gathering of data and looking at those antecedents, the behavior and the consequences is a summary in the form of a data-based hypothesis statement based on all of the data that we've gathered. Then the BIP follows the FBA, and it's simply the intervention plan that is directly linked to the hypothesis we just generated in the FBA. At a minimum, this BIP needs to include a prevention strategy that's based on that antecedent data. So how can we prevent the behavior of concern? Also an instructional strategy to teach an acceptable replacement behavior, and a reinforcement strategy that follows the replacement behavior and should serve the same function so that we're going to strengthen the likelihood that the replacement behavior is repeated. There also needs to be, within this whole comprehensive process, a plan to monitor fidelity of implementation, as well as a plan to monitor the student's response to the behavior intervention plan or the BIP. While data, hypotheses, and plan details are going to be unique to each student individually, the steps are systematic and they're really the same steps for all students in need of that tier 3 support. And that's what we want to kind of focus on is it's individualized, but the process should be comprehensive. It should be something that is, done with all students in need of that level of support. So let's think through some of the barriers to comprehensive FBA BIPs in schools. And we're going to show you on the right-hand side some ways that PTR can help us to overcome those barriers, or what we believe are ways that you can use PTR as a resource. You can probably relate to these barriers, such as sometimes there's minimal guidance related to those critical components of the FBA BIP process. Sometimes in our schools or in our districts, we don't have a lot of guidance or training for the folks that are involved in the process. When there is guidance and training, we often have a lot of clinical language, terms, and maybe even processes that don't seem feasible in school settings. So you can put together some really beautiful plans, but maybe it seems like a foreign language, or the plans do not seem like they would fit in a school setting. And then sometimes it comes down to a lack of training in applied behavior analysis, or sometimes it's the opposite. It's the training is so technical that school practitioners find that it's hard to apply that. So they might understand, but can't apply it. Or maybe it's just so technical that it's hard to really comprehend what that looks like in a school setting. So to overcome those barriers, what we want to show you is to highlight how PTR helps to use tools that are easy for teams and teachers to use and implement in school settings, easy to understand terms and language that's not technical and really clinical in nature. And then also, my personal favorite is the collaborative approach. So rather than relying on that expert model, PTR really uses a team-based process where consensus is built into each step of the process. And again, it's very collaborative. There's ongoing team and teacher support for implementation and database decision making.
And just something I wanted to add there real quick, Dama,
Mhm.
in thinking about the different processes you have within your school or within your district, what PTR allows the team to do using that collaborative approach is think about, some of the personnel, whether you have BCBAs within your district or school psychs who have that additional training in applied behavior analysis with regard to FBA or BIPs, they may not be somebody that you have readily available at the school, frequently. So PTR does provide tools for school-based teams to utilize in completing a comprehensive FBA BIP. So that those are some of those resources as well. And we'll walk you through that in just a minute.
Great point. Thank you, Brooke. So you may be thinking, okay, sounds good. Show me, sign me up. How can I, learn more? And Brooke will walk you through what the tools and resources look like, and we'll share with you a little bit about some upcoming professional development opportunities. So, and you may be thinking, I'm not sure if we have a systematic process. I'm school based and I don't really know what the district plans are, or maybe you're at the district level and you see some need for creating some more consistency across the process. Oftentimes we do have those folks that are maybe assigned or itinerant to school campuses to support students that need that level of support and intervention. And we want to maybe give you some guiding questions to think through whether or not PTR could enhance your current process, or as you kind of reflect on your current process. So I'm going to throw some questions and talk through some of the questions for you to consider or think about when deciding if PTR could enhance your current process. So think about your answers to these questions, such as, are your current FBA BIPs done with technical adequacy? That's kind of a clinical term, but are they done correctly? Are they done well? Are they, are those pieces that I went through earlier, do you feel like those components are part of the process and that folks use the different pieces that I outlined in our overview of a comprehensive FBA BIP process? And then as you think about that, are you getting the student outcomes that you intend to get or that you desire? So you can have a beautifully written plan, but if you're not getting the outcomes that you're looking for, then it doesn't really matter how great the plan is if it's not getting the results. Many of the questions to or answers to the questions that I'm going to throw up here have a direct impact on the other question. So, an answer to one question kind of ties into another. For example, if teachers are not implementing BIPs with fidelity, perhaps if the process was more collaborative, teachers would feel like they were part of the development of the plan and maybe be better equipped to implement with fidelity. So if I'm part of creating a plan, I'm going to have a little more, not just ownership and buy-in, but I helped create it so I understand a little bit more versus if you explain something to me and, tell me the steps to doing something. So sometimes the answers to these questions, they kind of tie together and help to solve, one problem helps to solve the other. Often the idea that tier 3 is individualized suggests that the process is unique. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago, it's unique to the individual student, but does your school or district have a consistent standardized process? So while that process, is then applied individually for students in need, are the steps the same? Do you use the same criteria to determine who needs that level of support and how you monitor their progress? The process should be consistent within the overall multi-tiered system of support. And the part that's individualized and unique is more about the function of the behavior that is then tied directly into that individualized behavior plan. And then if you think about, another question that you may see there related to student outcomes is if you're not getting the positive student outcomes you would expect, maybe an area to look at would be, what are your physical restraint and seclusion data? Like, what does that look like at the school level or on your campus? And that could help you determine, we think we have a pretty good process, but our numbers aren't really telling us that we're getting the outcomes we're looking for. So take a moment. I know I talked while you were looking at the questions, so it might have been a little distracting, but as you see those questions, take a moment and share your thoughts in the chat box around, some of your no responses. So if a question popped up and you were thinking the answer to that is no, would you personally suggest services as usual within your district or within your school? Or do you think it might be time to consider a shift in your process, again, within, if you're a school level person or district level? So take just a moment and share in the chat box your no, something that maybe popped up and you thought, the answer to that is no, or I have a lot of no's. I really think we need to make a shift. Might be PTR, it might not be, but maybe you see some room for improvement within the process that you currently use. So I'm going to keep moving and trust that Brooke or Betsy can see if there's something we want to mention or bring to everyone's attention. And you guys just interrupt me if you see something that might be noteworthy to bring up. I want to share this slide with you, PTR's impact compared to what we're going to refer to as services as usual. So just kind of your business as usual, the way you provide services at that tier 3 level or tier 3 support. And PTR was a research project that was funded by the Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education, and the Institute of Educational Sciences, IES research. It was conducted across Florida through the University of South Florida and Colorado. And you see some references there. So some of you may be interested in more details around the research behind this or the evidence behind it. I'm just going to highlight the major findings that we think are important to note. Would be the purpose of the research was really looking at whether or not PTR was more effective at improving student behavior and to evaluate the effectiveness of that collaborative standardized FBA BIP process. And overall, the results indicated improved social behaviors and academic engagement for students. And if you're thinking about the adults involved, teachers were better able to implement BIPs that were created. They were more willing to use PTR procedures, and they liked them compared to services as usual. And I think you'll see why when Brooke shares some of those resources in just a few. But I think it's just important to know that while they seem to be practical ways to implement what sometimes can feel like very technical procedures and policies, the outcomes of the research so far show that we see some positive student outcomes, improved social skills, and improvements around those problem behaviors and increases in the academic engaged time. But I personally think it's also very important to look at those teacher outcomes and see how can we use practices that are feasible for the adults that need to provide that level of support and to implement the supports that students need based on those plans that we put together in those team meetings. So,
And Dana, this is Betsy. I did notice that in the chat, some of the comments were regarding feeling like this would be more impactful for teachers to have some input. Sherry from Osceola wrote about how the tier 3 tends to be driven primarily by the school psychologist, and that there may not be much of a connection to the people that are actually implementing with the student.
Yes.
So that was one of the pieces of feedback.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And thanks, Betsy, for sharing that, because that really speaks to me, and coming from a background where, one of the hats I wore years ago was in that support role as a school psychologist and as a behavior specialist. And, you may come in with great ideas about, how to change behavior or how to conduct a functional behavior assessment. Those components that I showed, it looks nice, on a slide, or, when you're in an office putting together a behavior intervention plan. But I can speak to some of that personal experience, then going into a classroom and trying to implement the plan, or even, times that I've tried to model implementation and maybe do some of that coaching and training when you're in that real world setting in a classroom and things fall apart. As a support person, I can try that out, I can test it out, and I can observe and help out. But if I'm a classroom teacher and I'm trying to implement a plan and teach the rest of the students in my classroom and maintain, that safe and orderly environment, sometimes, what looks good on paper and in a plan or in the computer isn't always feasible and realistic. So giving tools and some collaborative voice, I think, to the implementers is really key in making things practical. So sorry for the brief side note there, but I'm glad you brought that up. And please, others, feel free to put some things in the chat box around your own experiences, or if you have questions. But that's why we think it's important to share PTR with you all, is that we get what MTSS is. We understand, the individual nature of providing tier 3 support, and we can talk through those pieces, but to give the tools to folks and to help with the process, to how do you apply the problem solving process at this level. And I think you'll enjoy seeing the resources that we can share with you, and provide some more training if interested. What you're going to notice, especially as we get into, let's say, this, particular slide around the 4-step problem solving process, it's really just kind of unpacking those 4 steps. So we know the problem solving process. We've talked about, on the right hand side, those steps around identifying the problem, analyzing why it's happening, putting together the interventions, implementing them, and looking at student response.
So I got myself in a little bit of a pickle, and I don't know how to respond.
I think
so
one of
Alex Remy emailed.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was thinking it might be a question directed at me, so I was trying to listen. So on the left side, the PTR 4-step process, let's look at it kind of like a crosswalk. So goal setting and data collection are the first step that I'll outline there, that kind of goes along with the first step of the problem solving process. And you'll see how they mirror one another. So goal setting and data collection is going to help the team to identify the problem. So resulting in that collaborative focus where the team is accurately coming up with an agreed upon problem from the beginning. I'm not sure if that's ever happened to you all, if you've been part of a problem solving team related to a student or even a systems issue, but oftentimes folks come in with their own kind of perspective and ideas about what the identified problem is. and assume that we're all on the same page. And sometimes we don't all agree on what that problem is. So with PTR, it really starts with goal setting and data collection to help the team together identify the problem and agree on it from the beginning. The second step includes the functional behavior assessment, where the team collaborates to analyze the problem that's been agreed upon and identified. And it ends with the hypothesis statement. So this lends to deeper understanding of the why as the team moves to the next step. And then for step 3, which in the problem solving process, you think about the intervention development or implementation. And if you think about within PTR, together the team is now going to develop the behavior intervention plan that's directly linked to the hypothesis that was generated during that functional behavior assessment phase. And the team builds in plans for coaching those involved in implementation. So, when you think about developing a behavior intervention plan and handing it, physically to someone and saying, here is the plan that we've come up with, and here's all the data and, what we put together as a hypothesis. With PTR, there's emphasis on coaching the folks that are involved, the implementers, the folks that are going to have a key role in making sure that the behavior intervention plan is implemented with fidelity. And then
Sorry, Dama, that was just one thing I was going to really point out, is that PTR is very explicit in the coaching plan and the feedback portion to ensure that the fidelity is critical to the implementation of the PBIP.
Yeah. Some of you may be teachers or former teachers or folks in non-instructional or paraprofessional types of positions. And if you've ever felt like you were maybe given a plan, or even in a meeting where it was developed, but then when it's time to actually, see it through and start the implementation, things suddenly feel different. It doesn't, maybe, you have more questions that you didn't think to ask because you didn't know what you didn't know. And my experience has been oftentimes that's where implementation fidelity issues creep in. It's, it's not that I don't want to do a good job, or as a teacher, I really want to not implement the plan, or have, I'm opposed to the plan, but more so maybe that coaching component that's missing, where PTR is, like Brooke said, very intentional around coaching to make sure that everyone understands their role, what it looks like, because we want to do these things with fidelity. So we know whether or not it's going to make a difference and it's going to work and be effective, so that we don't waste our time. And so we're not doing something that's not beneficial for the student. And then that final piece is the ongoing progress monitoring. And that's more than just looking at student progress. So, we think about the response to intervention, and that's important and critical. But with PTR, this also includes collaboratively determining the progress monitoring plans for coaching and for fidelity. Because ultimately, as a team, in that collaborative, teaming process, we want to determine the effect the plan had on the student's behavior and build decision rules for next steps. So it's not just, did the student respond to this intervention, but what was the fidelity piece? What was the coaching piece? How was the student's response? There are so many other pieces that go into determining next steps if something needs to be revised or done with, better fidelity or tweaked versus a poor response, and we need to move to a different step with a student. It's really about that progress monitoring from more of a big picture perspective, but specifically tied to those previous steps around coaching exactly what that plan is going to look like and when we're going to come back together to review data and to check in and to follow up. And hopefully you guys see, I know with the side-by-side, it's easy to see the similarity with the wording, but hopefully it makes sense as far as the application. And you can see that this is very aligned to that same 4-step problem solving process. It just kind of takes it, to me, to the more intentional, supportive level. So let's think a little bit about who are the PTR team members. And if you're like me and you've been in education or in these team meetings long enough, you've probably heard all kinds of names for different teams. Currently you may have different names for different teams that you're part of. And so I'm just the PTR team that I refer to here. This is the team of folks that are working through this process. And the PTR model of the FBA BIP starts with really a student-centered team. So everything about this work is around the student. And it's important that the team includes members who represent three very different types of knowledge. And it's very intentional and purposeful. And so I'll outline it, and then I challenge you as you're thinking through the words and looking at the slide, think through, if you're a part of a team, do you feel like you have the membership there that really represents these three different types of knowledge? Someone who knows the student well and has observed the student's problem behavior in the settings that the behaviors commonly occur. Really, firsthand knowledge of the student is going to be so important as you move through those steps, because that person that has the firsthand knowledge, has a lot of information that other folks that are part of this team don't have. And some of that can be hard to be objective when you have so much firsthand knowledge, but it's so critical that somebody who knows the student well is a member of the team. Also, someone who understands the behavioral principles that are really behind the FBA and the BIP. So, if parts of, the looking at the antecedent and looking at the consequence, and if some of that, really the data analysis piece and what it takes to change behavior, those components are really important to have somebody who's knowledgeable about those applied behavior analysis ideas. And that knowledge is going to be very important to help with changing and molding and shaping and instructing behavior. And then that third type of knowledge is somebody who understands the context of the school and or the district, somebody that understands policies and procedures, but also has the authority to allocate resources. And again, I don't know if you've been a part of a team, with that frustration, but sometimes there, is let's say a classroom teacher and or parent who really knows the student and knows the student well, and has seen the behavior of concern in the setting or in action. And you've got, the school psychologist or a behavior analyst or somebody that's at the table that really understands behavior, and you all put together great plans. But if you don't have a person there that can allocate resources to free up time, if the team decides that there's a specific person or paraprofessional or role that needs to play an integral part of the BIP, but somebody that makes those decisions is not at the table to allocate the resource, then that can really make things fall apart. So those are three critical team members to be part of that conversation and part of that problem solving and planning. If you think about the things to consider, those are also very important, I think, to think about. Somebody, again, if you're thinking about somebody with that PTR or FBA type background and knowledge, the person that's knowledgeable about those behavioral principles, along with that knowledge base, that person also needs to have good interpersonal skills. So if I'm really smart, but I rub people the wrong way and I don't explain things well, or I, fall into that habit of using a lot of clinical technical language, that's not helpful. So it's important that those team members, have the interpersonal skills, the communication skills. Sometimes the things to consider might go across different roles, but it's important to think about who's really good at allocating resources, about training and communicating well, who is going to be, very good at that, helping us really understand the student and the context in which the behavior occurs, and who are the people that are going to have direct contact and responsibility in implementing the plan so that they can be part of building it, collaborating. because those folks really need to have great understanding and knowledge of what the plan is, how it's tied to the function of the behavior, because a lot of it is the intent behind it, right? So you put together a behavior intervention plan, but if you don't really understand the intent behind some of those prevention piece or instruction pieces or reinforcement pieces, then that can be tricky because you're not really sure why you're doing the steps that you're doing. And what I'm going to do next, as I transition into Brooke sharing with you what the resources look like, I just want to highlight that the process includes tools and resources that are going to support the team and the team members to carry out the 4-step process. So you see they're identified, within the tools and resources here. And Brooke will share with us and highlight the resources, what they look like and how they're tied to, for instance, step 1, looking at data collection and how to use that individualized behavior rating scale tool to gather data for step 1, and so on and so forth. So she'll share resources that are tied to each of the steps, what they look like, and then it won't be an in-depth training, but we will talk to you a little bit about some opportunities for more detailed training if you're interested in that after today's TA chat. All right.
Thank you, Dama. As Dama mentioned, the PTR process really does start with that student-centered team. And then from there, once you have your team set, you're going to go through essentially the 4-step problem-solving process. And we follow 4 steps in PTR, but they break it down into the area of data collection and goal setting, then the actual assessment piece, that implementation plan, with the follow-up of progress monitoring, where that coaching and fidelity is across those other 2 steps there at the end. So rather than take you through the how-to of PTR, we're going to show you some of those tools and resources built within PTR that could help your teams overcome some of those barriers that Dama first described at the start of this chat. So the first data collection tool that I'm going to share with you is what's called the Individual Behavior Rating Scale Tool, or what's sometimes referred to as the iBurst. So this tool is used as part of step 1 of the PTR process related to data collection and goal setting, which again mirrors that problem identification piece of problem solving. So the function of the iBurst is to really measure your problem behaviors, and you're also going to measure what's one appropriate behavior or potentially your replacement skill. So what we want to do is that as you include both the target problem behavior that your team's hoping to reduce and you have the appropriate behavior to increase, it should be easy enough for the teacher or whoever's the interventionist in order to use. So you're going to create, the team collaborates creating a key for the teacher to use. You can see that they utilize it like a hybrid model of direct observation with a Likert rating scale. So in this case is 1 through 5, but there's a lot of flexibility. And so, for example, if your problem behavior included hitting, the team would come up with what that definition looks like if you were to observe it at a level 5, where it might be that they're hitting, 20 times a day versus a level 1 where it may be they only hit 1 or 2 times a day. So it's observable and measurable, but it's also quick and efficient for the teacher to be able to go in and combine that direct observation with that hybrid assessment. There's a lot of flexibility. You can use it across periods, problem areas, things of that nature. And what's also really nice about this tool is as the teacher fills in the ratings, it will also create a visual representation or graph that the team could then use to help make decisions. Go ahead to the next slide, Dama. Thank you. So that's part of your step 1 with your goal setting. So once you know what behaviors you're looking for, what behavior you want to reduce, and you've established your goals and problem ID, you move into the assessment piece, which again mirrors that functional behavioral assessment, where you're looking at the things that occur before problem behaviors or that prevention component. You're going to look at those skills that the child or student might be lacking that could be contributing to the problem behavior. So that teach component, what does the child need in order to be successful to engage in that replacement skill? And you're also going to look at the reinforced component. So what this is it's a tool, and it can be done in a variety of ways. It can even be given out almost like a homework assignment to the team, those critical people on the team, that they then can complete this assessment. And excuse me, as a facilitator, then the job will be to summarize and bring that assessment together. So there's different assessments. You can see that they provide you one for elementary students. There's also assessment tools for secondary students who might have multiple teachers. And there's also one PTR assessments for the students themselves, although that one is really recommended to be given as an interview. So again, it's completed potentially as a homework type task or within the assessment team meeting. And that information that is obtained here is then pulled together by the facilitator into the assessment summary for the team, which looks something like this. So here's an example of how that summary table is used to view the input. So again, the information gets placed into different categories. So this is where that facilitator who has that extra knowledge of applied behavior analysis or functional assessments, they can help identify that information and put it into those different categories, utilizing their consultation skills, look at that shared agreement among team members. It's also important that even if you have, team members who might have a lot of agreement, say on the prevent side of some antecedent strategies, but that the facilitator may have observed or noted a trigger that would be a direct link to the behavior, it might be something where they could then also discuss with the team about how they can include that. So again, that's why you have that facilitator who still has that background knowledge, but again, the team is the one that's showing the collaboration of those trends across these different areas, with the goal to come up with the summary hypothesis statement like seen at the bottom. So that hypothesis reaches consensus from the team, which then will directly influence how that behavior intervention plan is built. The team meets again to discuss what that intervention plan will look like. So they will go then to those same three categories of prevention, teaching, and reinforcing, and the team will collaborate using this sample intervention menu and checklist. We have on the next slide, don't go yet, Dama, you'll have a secondary example as well. So in this example of the elementary intervention menu, basically the facilitator again provides this menu to each team member, asking them to rank order between 2 and 4 interventions in each of the different categories, the prevent category and teach category. You'll notice in the teach category, for example, there's the asterisk there to really highlight that you need to include a strategy for teaching those replacement behaviors. Those are, again, typically going to be ones that have already been identified through that iBurst. You can select others. You also want to make sure that the reinforced category requires the team to make sure they're reinforcing both interventions to those replacement skills. And then they determine how those interventions will be implemented in the classroom. So you can see it's a very structured process to ensure that the team's focused on the critical components of that FBA and BBIP. Then we have the secondary example as well. It follows that same process of the prevention components, the teaching components, and the reinforcement components. And then the student version, they can provide input as well. So you can see that PTR really has ensured that they are getting input from multiple perspectives. It's really collaborative. The idea, again, is that you're seeing these things and the facilitator is able to show where there is common ideas being seen, and every voice is getting heard equally, and with the forms, as opposed to potentially doing things either in a roundtable discussion, where sometimes if it is being facilitated by somebody who might be perceived as an expert, a teacher may not feel comfortable sharing that this is really all I'm comfortable doing is, giving choices or giving a visual reminder. So this is where that teacher and the interventionist can really say, here's my 2 to 4 interventions that I'm really comfortable using, and they can collaborate and make sure that those things all align with the functional hypothesis that was created from the FBA portion. The last component, or one of the last components, I should say, is part of setting up the fidelity steps and coaching. So again, in PTR, it's a very explicit process. This is a sample of how a team created a coaching fidelity form. And what it really does is it's outlining the adult behaviors. So we know exactly what it is that we want to see from the adults in terms of implementing the plan. It can also be used as that fidelity piece, not just in coaching, but it really sets the stage for what is it that we're looking for. It also sets the stage and outlines how are we going to provide that initial coaching session, and how are we going to provide the additional follow-up coaching sessions. So again, you're using it as your training checklist, you're monitoring your fidelity. It also goes into talking about how the teacher would feel best receiving feedback. Some teachers or interventionists may feel comfortable that while the coach is in there observing and doing a fidelity check, that if there's an error, say, in how they're providing the reinforcement, to interrupt that session, if you will, and provide feedback in session, whereas others want to wait till after the session's over, provide more feedback, give a role play. The other thing that's really great about PTR, both with the iBurst and this coaching tools, if at any time within those sessions, the interventionist, the teacher, or the paraprofessional, or whoever's delivering the intervention realizes that something's maybe too cumbersome or they misunderstood something, it allows for the team to really go back and review and reset that part of the process, because the goal is that we're implementing it with fidelity and as intended. So the last tool that's part of PTR is they give you tools to help with the progress monitoring piece. Like Dama said, a lot of our FBA and BIP processes that we see in place, we know about these things and perhaps are even doing a lot of these things. But we don't necessarily have that structured, consistent process so that it's the same across school campus, across from school to school within a district, so that you're yielding those similar outcomes in terms of process where it's individualized for the student. So this is just a sample of a tool used for progress monitoring and decision making, where the team gets together at their set intervals that have been predetermined. And the PTR manual kind of maps it out for you of how often and frequently you should be meeting. But the tool allows the team to answer that series of questions. Depending on their answers, it directs them to where they should be making adjustments with their plan. So you can see in question 1, was the intervention successful and did the behavior meet their criteria level, their goal? If the answer is yes, they jump to question 5, where the team then decides, what are our next steps? We're not going to just stop the FBA or the BIP, but is this a behavior and are the child's skills at a level where they would be successful without? And if so, how do we expand that plan or extend it to other areas where they might be having trouble, or other people? So that generalization piece, or this is effective and we've taught this one replacement skill, but they really need another replacement skill. Can we carry the same plan into teaching new skills? Or are we ready to start fading out different parts of the plan? So that's where, again, you have a little bit of that guidance that you would get from an expert model, but this one's here is collaborative within your team. And then you can see if it's not being successful, it goes back to asking questions centered around fidelity, like you see in number 3 there. No, the intervention was not successful, but yes, it was implemented as intended. So we have to go back. Do we need to give it more time? Do we need to change the plan? Do we need to go back to the FBA? Maybe we were split on some of those prevention pieces. So let's go back and maybe we need to tweak it and try the other one. So it really walks you through ways that you can make some different decisions for that. So in summary of PTR supporting that comprehensive Tier 3 process, it is still a 4-step problem-solving process that is student-centered. PTR provides that more standardized or a manualized process with the tools to help support the team so that you have that consistency across your school campus or across your district, making sure that you're getting those technically adequate FBA and BIPs. It also ensures that every intervention plan includes those 3 important components of prevention, teaching, and reinforcing. They also ensure that those plans are really task analyzed. We didn't talk about that too much here today because that's a part of the bigger training, but really it's how are we breaking down each of the individual components to ensure that the implementer knows how to carry out the plan. And again, it really is about providing that ongoing coaching support to the teacher and team in order to effectively implement those interventions. And it's really focused on that database decision to help make those next step decisions to really yield outcomes that are positive for our students. I know one of those questions that Dama was asking as far as should we continue with services as usual versus potentially utilizing a strategy or a process like PTR. And one of those questions had to deal with student outcomes and that technical adequacy. And it really brings back to mind that when I was in the schools, you would see lots of really great FBAs and behavior intervention plans, but we didn't get the outcomes that we were wanted. We continued to see students having behavioral difficulties that led to the need for either ESE supports or evaluation, as opposed to we were able to get in there, intervene, fade out those supports, and do it in a very systematic way so that our triangle didn't continue to utilize those resources at the top. So if any of these resources or information shared with you today is something that you think your school or your district would be interested in learning more about, we are in the process of working on our PTR training, which should be completed sometime this spring. So hopefully we'll be able to offer that training come late spring or summer of this year. And as Dama mentioned at the beginning, if you're a district coordinator on the call, reach out to your TA specialist if this is something that you think is necessary or needed for your Tier 3 processes. If you're a school contact and you want to learn more about it, get with your district coordinator and we can start getting you some information and see if your school is ready to start taking on some of these revisions to your Tier 3 process. And just as we always do in concluding our chats, please don't forget to follow apbs.org, join it, get updates through their social media as well. Join them for the conferences. We got one coming up here in March. We also have the availability for the graduate certificate in positive behavior support. If anybody's interested in that, you can contact us there. And we hope to see you at our next chat coming up February 10th. It will be Dama and I again, and we will be talking with you about specific practices to support disciplinary equity. So if you have any equity issues going on or you want to learn more about how to support that, please join us for that chat coming up.